Smet, Dakota Territory, October 15, 1880. While his neighbors scrambled to stockpile coal and store-bought flour before winter hit, Charles Ingalls was out in the slough grass, twisting prairie stems into tight rope-like sticks. The town called it wasteful. They called him poor. Real settlers bought coal from the railroad, not fuel from a swamp. Pa kept twisting anyway, dense bundles of sedge grass compressed so tight they burned like wood logs. His neighbors built their winter plans around one assumption: the trains would keep running. Pa built his around what would still be growing when the trains stopped. Then December arrived and the railroad died. 7 months of blizzards buried the tracks 20 feet deep. Coal bins emptied, store shelves went bare. Families burned their furniture, then frozen houses that couldn't hold heat. But that poor man's cabin, it stayed warm enough to work without gloves, fueled entirely by twisted grass that cost nothing but labor. What did Pa Ingalls understand about prairie biomass and supply chain failure that left his neighbors shivering while his family stayed fed and warm until spring? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The October wind cut across the Dakota prairie like a blade, carrying the smell of snow that shouldn't arrive for another month. Charles Ingalls stood knee-deep in the slough grass east of Smet, his hands working steadily despite the cold that made his neighbors hurry indoors. While they counted coal deliveries and calculated how much store flour they'd need before spring, Pa twisted prairie stems into tight, rope-like bundles that most folks would call kindling, fit only for starting fires, not sustaining them. The technique looked simple enough to mock. Take a handful of coarse slough grass, the thick-stemmed sedge that grew wild in every low spot across the territory, and twist it like you're making rope. Keep twisting until the stems compress into a dense stick that feels solid in your hands. The neighbors who bothered to watch called it the work of a man too poor to buy proper fuel or too stubborn to admit the railroad had made such primitive methods obsolete. Real settlers, they said, planned ahead. Real settlers bought coal by the ton and had it delivered on schedule. Pa had tried that approach the previous winter. Like every newcomer to Dakota Territory, he'd learned that coal burned clean and hot, that it lasted longer than wood, and that the railroad brought it right to Smet's depot on a predictable schedule. The method worked fine when the trains ran. But October 15th had brought something that tested predictable schedules, a 3-day blizzard that dropped 3 feet of snow and blocked every rail line within 200 miles. The storm cleared, the tracks reopened, and normal deliveries resumed. But Pa had spent those 3 days watching his coal bin shrink and wondering what would happen if the train stopped for more than a few days. That question led him to the slough grass and the knowledge he'd picked up from a Russian Mennonite family who'd settled 20 miles south. They'd shown him how prairie grass, when twisted properly, could burn with enough consistency to heat a house. Not just emergency heat for a single night, but steady warmth that could last weeks if you had enough grass and enough patience to keep twisting. The method required labor instead of money, time instead of faith in supply schedules, and the willingness to look like a fool while you learned. The grass had to be the right kind, coarse slough stems that grew thick and fibrous, not the soft meadow grass that crumbled in your hands. It needed to be slightly damp when you twisted it, dry enough to burn, but moist enough to compress without snapping. Pa would gather armloads of the stuff, sort out the thickest stems, and then begin the repetitive work of twisting each bundle into a tight spiral that held its shape like a piece of rope. The finished sticks measured about 18 inches long and 2 inches thick, dense enough that they burned slowly and put out substantial heat when fed into a stove designed for wood or coal. His neighbors saw the piles of twisted grass growing beside his house and shook their heads. Store owner Fuller complained that men like Ingalls made the whole town look backward, like they couldn't afford civilized heating methods. The banker's wife mentioned loudly that some families clearly needed guidance on proper winter preparation. Even the newer settlers, who'd arrived with high hopes and Eastern money, treated Pa's grass twisting as a sign of frontier desperation rather than frontier wisdom. The mockery came with specific comparisons that made Pa's method sound like failure. Standard families bought coal by the ton, usually 2 to 3 tons for a severe winter. Pa bought 1 ton and planned to stretch it by burning grass. Normal households stockpiled store flour, 50-pound sacks that would last a family of 6 through the cold months. Pa bought less flour and kept a coffee mill ready to grind wheat if store supplies ran short. The conventional approach meant paying cash up front and trusting the railroad to deliver on schedule. Pa's approach meant working harder and trusting what grew locally. December brought the test. The 15th of the month arrived with another blizzard, this one lasting 4 days and dumping snow so deep that the railroad tracks disappeared entirely. When the storm cleared, work crews found cuts filled with snow, packed solid as concrete, hard enough that shovels bent and picks were needed to chip through to the rails. This wasn't the kind of blockade that cleared in a few days with extra crews and determination. This was the kind that required digging out, 20 feet of compressed snow and ice, mile after mile, while more storms kept adding to the pile. The trains stopped running, store deliveries ended, coal supplies in town began dropping toward levels that would force families to choose between heat and cooking fuel. Men who'd laughed at Pa's grass bundles started watching his hands work, noting how he selected stems and how tightly he twisted them. Women who dismissed his method as embarrassing poverty started asking Caroline Ingalls quiet questions about how long twisted grass actually burned and whether it put out enough heat to keep a house livable. By Christmas, the arithmetic had become unavoidable. Coal bins that should have lasted until March were half empty. Store flour supplies had dwindled to what families could ration carefully until spring, if spring came early and the trains resumed. The railroad company sent word through the telegraph that crews were working to clear the lines, but no promises could be made about when normal service would resume. Smet found itself cut off from the supply chain that had made winter survival seem automatic, reduced to whatever resources lay within walking distance of town. Pa's twisted grass suddenly looked less like poverty and more like preparation. His method hadn't changed. He still spent hours each day gathering slough stems and twisting them into fuel sticks. But now his neighbors saw those bundles as the difference between staying warm and burning furniture, between maintaining normal household routines and descending into the kind of desperation that froze families to death in houses that couldn't hold heat. The town had bet on the railroad. Pa had bet on the prairie. And winter had called the bet. By Christmas Day, the trains had been silent for 10 days. The depot stood empty except for drifted snow that had blown through broken windows, and the telegraph operator confirmed what everyone already knew. No locomotives could punch through cuts packed, with 20 feet of snow that froze solid each night. The temperature had dropped to 19 below zero on Christmas Eve, and families across Smet faced a calculation that stripped away all pretense about railroad reliability and proper winter planning. Charles Ingalls had developed his hay fuel production into a daily routine that consumed 3 hours of hard labor, but produced enough heat to keep his house livable. Each morning, he walked to the slough grass beds east of town, selecting stems that met specific criteria learned through weeks of trial and error. The grass had to be coarse sedge, not soft meadow varieties that burned too quickly. It needed enough moisture to twist without snapping, but not so much that it smoldered instead of flaming. The ideal stems measured 18 to 24 inches long and showed the thick fibrous structure that compressed into dense fuel sticks. The twisting process required technique that Pa had refined through repetition and mistakes. He gathered the stems into bundles, roughly 2 inches in diameter, then began rolling them between his palms while applying steady pressure. The key was maintaining consistent tension. Too loose, and the stick fell apart. Too tight, and the stems broke under pressure. As he twisted, Pa folded the bundle back on itself, creating a double-thick stick that measured about 18 inches long when finished. The completed fuel stick felt solid in his hands, dense enough to burn slowly but dry enough to ignite reliably when placed in the stove. Production numbers told the story of survival reduced to measurable work. Pa could twist approximately 40 fuel sticks per hour when the grass conditions were right and his hands hadn't stiffened from cold. Each stick burned for roughly 20 minutes in his heating stove, providing enough heat to warm the main room of their house. A full day's heating required about 36 sticks, which meant Pa needed to maintain production of at least 40 sticks daily to stay ahead of consumption, with extra bundles set aside for the coldest nights when the stove needed constant feeding. The labor was methodical, but exhausting. Pa's hands developed calluses from the constant twisting motion, and the repetitive work left his wrists aching by evening. But the alternative was watching his coal supply disappear into a stove that consumed fuel like a hungry animal, burning through expensive purchased coal while no trains ran to bring more. Families who'd planned on 2 tons of coal for the winter found themselves rationing what remained, burning smaller fires that barely took the edge off interior temperatures that dropped toward freezing. Caroline Ingalls had adapted the household routine around Pa's fuel production schedule, timing cooking and washing to make the most efficient use of heat while the twisted grass burned. She learned that the grass fuel required more frequent tending than coal, feeding new sticks into the firebox every 20 minutes instead of loading coal that burned steadily for hours. But the grass burned clean when properly dried, producing less ash than wood, and maintaining more consistent heat than she'd expected from what looked like primitive kindling. The weather data that reached Smet through telegraph reports confirmed what everyone felt in their bones. This winter was testing the limits of normal preparation. January temperatures in the region swung between a high of 36 degrees and a low of 32 below zero, creating conditions that stressed heating systems and consumed fuel at rates that outstripped most families' calculations. February brought readings as low as 23 below, with winds that drove the cold through every gap in construction and forced stoves to work harder to maintain livable indoor temperatures. Snow conditions made the railroad's promises of reopening seem increasingly hollow. Each new storm added layers that packed down under wind and cold into surfaces so hard that crews needed picks and crowbars to break through. The snow mixed with blown soil created a concrete-like mass that filled railroad cuts completely, requiring excavation rather than simple plowing. Reports from section crews described digging operations that advanced only hundreds of yards per day, mile after mile, while new storms kept adding to the accumulation faster than men could clear it. Pa's twisted grass method began drawing observers who no longer pretended to mock what they were studying. Store owner Fuller, whose coal inventory had dwindled to what he reserved for his own family, asked direct questions about grass selection and twisting technique. The banker's family, facing the prospect of burning furniture when their coal ran out, sent their teenage son to watch Pa work and learn the hand motions that produced consistently dense fuel sticks. Other families attempted to copy the method with mixed results that highlighted the importance of technique over simply having the right materials. Loose twisting produced sticks that fell apart when handled, while over-twisting broke the stems and created bundles that wouldn't ignite properly. The grass itself required selection skills that Pa had developed through weeks of experimentation, knowing which stem thickness worked best, how to judge proper moisture content, and where to find the coarse slough grass that grew thick enough to compress into effective fuel. The social dynamics of survival revealed themselves in small transactions that would have seemed impossible in October. Families with coffee mills originally purchased for grinding coffee beans found themselves lending the devices to neighbors who needed to convert seed wheat into flour. Coal became a commodity traded in small quantities, doled out by the shovelful rather than sold by the ton. Knowledge about fuel alternatives spread through conversations that began with desperate questions and ended with hands-on demonstrations of techniques that separated working solutions from wishful thinking. By late January, Pa's daily grass twisting had evolved from an individual's survival strategy into something approaching a neighborhood workshop. Men who'd initially dismissed the method as embarrassing now brought their own bundles of slough grass and tried to match Pa's hand motions, learning through repetition and correction how to produce fuel sticks that actually worked when fed into stoves designed for coal and wood. The twisted grass had become more than emergency fuel. It had become proof that what grew locally could substitute for what had to be shipped in if you knew how to process it properly and were willing to work for your heat instead of simply buying it. The second crisis arrived not with dramatic collapse, but with the quiet arithmetic of empty shelves. By February 1st, Fuller's store had reduced flour sales to 5 pounds per family per week, and even that strict rationing couldn't stretch supplies indefinitely when no trains brought fresh stock. Families who'd planned their winter food around store-bought flour and canned goods found themselves staring at bare pantries, while telegraph reports confirmed that railroad crews were still digging through cuts packed solid with snow and ice, advancing only hundreds of yards each day through obstacles that stretched for miles. Charles Ingalls had anticipated this secondary failure when he'd set aside seed wheat in late fall, not the cleaned, milled flour that most families bought from the store, but raw grain intended for spring planting. The decision had seemed wasteful to neighbors who pointed out that seed wheat cost more than regular flour and required additional work to make it edible. But Pa understood that stored grain could serve dual purposes: plant it if the spring came normally, or grind it into flour if the food supply failed before the trains resumed. The tool that made grain conversion possible sat on a shelf in thousands of frontier households without anyone recognizing its potential value. The coffee mill had been designed for a simple morning task, grinding coffee beans into powder fine enough for brewing. But the same mechanism that crushed coffee beans could process wheat kernels into coarse meal, and with patience and technique, produce flour fine enough for baking bread. Pa's mill was a standard cast iron model with adjustable grinding plates and a hand crank that required steady pressure to produce consistent results. The milling process began with cleaning the wheat, a step that separated survival from serious illness. Seed wheat contained chaff, dirt, small stones, and other debris that had to be removed before grinding. Pa spread the grain on a clean cloth and picked through it kernel by kernel, removing anything that wasn't wheat. Grinding contaminated grain could damage the mill's mechanism, while stone particles in flour would wear down teeth and cause digestive problems that could prove fatal when medical care was unavailable and bodies were already stressed by cold and limited food. Once cleaned, the wheat required a two-stage grinding process that converted hard kernels into usable flour. The first pass through the coffee mill cracked the grain into coarse pieces, loosening the outer hull and exposing the interior starch that contained the nutritional value. Pa adjusted the mill's grinding plates to their widest setting for this initial pass, turning the hand crank slowly to avoid jamming the mechanism with too much grain at once. The cracked wheat that emerged looked more like animal feed than human food, but it represented the first stage in converting seed into sustenance. The second grinding pass produced flour fine enough for baking, though the process required patience and physical endurance that tested the limits of hand-powered equipment. Pa tightened the mill's grinding plates and fed the cracked wheat back through the mechanism, this time grinding it into progressively finer meal. The work was slow and laborious. A coffee mill could process approximately 2 cups of wheat per hour when operated steadily, and the repetitive cranking motion quickly fatigued hands and wrists that were already strained from daily hay-twisting work. The flour that emerged from this process differed significantly from store-bought varieties in texture, color, and baking properties. Hand-ground wheat produced coarse meal that contained more of the grain's outer layers, creating flour that looked darker and felt grittier than the refined white flour that most families preferred. But this coarser meal retained more nutrients, and more importantly, it provided the carbohydrates and calories needed to sustain life when other food sources had disappeared. Caroline Ingalls adapted her baking techniques to work with the limitations and advantages of hand-ground flour. The coarse meal absorbed more water than regular flour, requiring adjustments to traditional bread recipes that had been developed for store-bought ingredients. She learned to knead the dough longer to develop gluten structure in the rougher flour, and to bake loaves at lower temperatures for extended periods to ensure thorough cooking. The bread that resulted was dense and heavy compared to what the family had eaten before the crisis, but it provided filling, nutritious meals that stretched their limited grain supplies through the long winter months. The coffee mill became the most valuable piece of equipment in households that possessed one, and the most desperately needed tool among families that had never owned one. Neighbors who'd previously borrowed cups of sugar or shared garden vegetables now found themselves negotiating for access to grinding equipment that could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation. The mill that had been designed to improve morning coffee service had become a small factory that converted raw agricultural products into survival rations. Pa's grain reserves represented a calculated gamble that revealed itself through daily consumption numbers. A family of 6 required approximately 3 pounds of flour daily to maintain adequate calorie intake during cold weather when bodies burned more energy to stay warm. At that consumption rate, a 50-pound sack of wheat could provide flour for roughly 16 days. Pa had stored 200 pounds of seed wheat, enough to supply his family for approximately 2 months if supplemented with other food sources, or longer if carefully rationed and stretched with wild game or preserved vegetables. The social dynamics around food sharing became more complex as the crisis deepened. Families with coffee mills found themselves approached by neighbors who brought their own grain and requested grinding services in exchange for labor or other goods. Pa helped several households learn the milling process, sharing techniques for grain cleaning, proper grinding speeds, and flour handling that determined whether the final product would be edible or waste precious resources through spoilage or contamination. Other families attempted milling with improvised tools that demonstrated the importance of proper equipment for survival tasks. Some tried crushing wheat with hammers and stones, producing inconsistent meal that contained too many large pieces and too much debris. Others experimented with repurposing other household tools for grain processing, with results that ranged from marginally successful to complete failures that wasted irreplaceable seed wheat. By mid-February, the combination of twisted grass fuel and hand-ground flour had established the Ingalls family as practitioners of survival methods that looked primitive but delivered measurable results. While other households burned furniture and rationed their last pounds of store flour, Pa's family maintained something approaching normal domestic routines, heated by grass, that grew wild around town and fed by grain that could be processed with tools they already owned. The methods required more labor and produced lower quality results than railroad-delivered supplies, but they provided heat and food when the conventional system had completely failed. By the last week of February, Smet had reached the edge of what measured preparation could accomplish. Store owner Fuller locked his remaining flour supplies in a back room, rationing what little remained to families with the youngest children. The coal that had seemed abundant in October was now counted by the shovelful, with most families facing the prospect of cold houses before March arrived. Telegraph reports confirmed that railroad crews were still fighting through snow-packed cuts, but their progress measured in hundreds of yards suggested that normal supply deliveries remained weeks away at minimum. The crisis had compressed survival into a mathematics problem that eliminated everything except essential calories and heat. Families counted remaining food in days rather than meals, while calculating whether their fuel supplies could maintain livable temperatures through what weather patterns suggested might stretch into April. Some households had already begun burning wooden furniture and interior fixtures, trading their belongings for temporary warmth that consumed irreplaceable resources while providing no sustainable solution to the underlying problem. It was during this period of measured desperation that Almanzo Wilder and Cap Garland approached Pa Ingalls with information that would become central to the town's survival legend, though the exact details of what followed have been preserved primarily through Laura Ingalls Wilder's later narrative accounts, rather than independent historical documentation. According to the story that emerged, the two young men had learned of a homesteader 12 miles southeast who possessed wheat stores that he might be willing to sell, despite the dangerous travel conditions that had isolated individual homesteads from town commerce. The proposed journey represented the kind of calculated risk that frontier communities faced when conventional supply chains collapsed entirely. 12 miles of travel across open prairie in February, conditions meant navigating by fence lines and section markers when visibility allowed, while managing horses whose breathing created ice formations that could obstruct their airways in extreme cold. The temperature had reached 32 below zero earlier that month, creating conditions where exposed skin froze within minutes, and where sweat from physical exertion could prove fatal if it soaked clothing and then froze against the body. Wilder and Garland prepared for the expedition with techniques that represented accumulated prairie travel wisdom passed between experienced frontier residents. They wrapped their horses' bridles in cloth to prevent metal from freezing to the animal's skin, and carried rope that could serve as a lifeline between riders if blowing snow reduced visibility to arm's length. Each man wore multiple layers of wool clothing covered by wind-resistant outer garments, with special attention to protecting extremities that would freeze first in prolonged cold exposure. The navigation challenge required skills that separated experienced plainsmen from settlers who'd learned to depend on established roads and regular landmarks. Winter storms had obliterated fence lines in many areas, leaving only occasional posts protruding above snowdrifts to mark property boundaries and section lines. The men would need to maintain their sense of direction across featureless white terrain, where distances became impossible to judge, and where small navigation errors could lead them miles off course into empty prairie where exposure would prove fatal. According to the account that became part of the Smet legend, the journey succeeded in locating the isolated homesteader and securing wheat supplies that could be transported back to town. The grain quantity has been reported as 30 bushels in some versions and 60 bushels in others, reflecting the way survival stories grow and change through retelling while preserving their essential message about resourcefulness and community cooperation during crisis conditions. The return journey presented additional challenges related to hauling grain across difficult terrain while managing horses that were already stressed by cold and overexertion. Wheat sacks weighing 60 to 80 pounds each had to be loaded and secured on sleds that could navigate through snowdrifts and around obstacles that blocked direct routes back to Smet. The men faced the constant risk of equipment failure, animal injury, or weather changes that could trap them in open country where survival time was measured in hours rather than days. Weather persistence continued to demonstrate why the railroad remained blocked and why normal supply delivery seemed increasingly unlikely before spring. Regional temperature records showed that even April would bring nighttime lows around 3 degrees below zero, indicating that the severe conditions stressing heating systems and fuel supplies would continue for weeks beyond what most families had planned for when making their October preparations. The wheat rescue, whether it occurred exactly as later described or represents a compressed version of multiple supply gathering efforts, illustrated the fundamental challenge facing isolated frontier communities when their primary supply systems failed. Towns that had grown dependent on railroad delivery schedules found themselves forced back onto older survival methods that required direct action, physical risk, and intimate knowledge of local resources and travel conditions. Pa's response to the developing crisis remained consistent with his earlier approach to fuel and food preparation. While others organized rescue, missions, and emergency supply runs, he continued the daily labor of twisting grass into fuel sticks and grinding wheat into flour, maintaining systems that required constant work but produced predictable results. His methods couldn't solve the entire town's supply problems, but they provided a foundation of heat and food security that allowed his family to survive while community leaders debated more dramatic solutions. The contrast between individual preparation and community crisis management revealed different philosophies about frontier survival that would influence how similar situations were handled in later years. Pa's approach emphasized local resource utilization and labor-intensive methods that could be maintained regardless of transportation conditions or supply chain reliability. The wheat rescue approach represented coordinated risk-taking that could provide larger quantities of supplies, but depended on favorable conditions, successful navigation, and the availability of distant resources that might not exist in future crises. By early March, Smet had survived the worst of the supply crisis through a combination of individual innovation, community cooperation, and calculated risks that pushed the limits of what winter travel and resource acquisition could accomplish. The town's survival demonstrated both the vulnerability of frontier communities dependent on single supply lines and the resourcefulness that could emerge when conventional planning failed and residents were forced to rely on immediate local resources and accumulated survival knowledge. The first train whistle heard in Smet since December echoed across the prairie on May 3, 1881, carrying the sound of normal commerce returning to a town that had survived 7 months of supply line failure through methods that ranged from desperate improvisation to proven traditional knowledge. The locomotive that pulled into the depot brought mail, manufactured goods, fresh, flour, and coal, all the conveniences that residents had learned to live without, while developing survival systems based on what grew locally and what could be processed with hand tools. Charles Ingalls greeted the train's arrival not with relief but with quiet satisfaction that his family had maintained normal household routines throughout the crisis. While neighbors struggled with fuel shortages, food rationing, and heating systems that failed when purchased supplies ran out. His daily grass-twisting operation had produced enough fuel to keep the house livable through temperature extremes that reached 32 below zero, while his hand-milling system had converted seed wheat into bread flour that sustained his family when store shelves emptied and remained bare for months. The vindication came not through dramatic recognition or community ceremonies, but through the quiet adoption of methods that neighbors had initially dismissed as signs of poverty or poor planning. Store owner Fuller, whose coal inventory had disappeared in January, approached Pa for instruction in grass fuel preparation techniques that could serve as emergency backup systems for future winters. The banker's family, who'd burned furniture to stay warm in February, asked detailed questions about slough grass selection and twisting methods that could supplement purchased fuel when supply deliveries failed. Other households began investing in coffee mills, not for morning beverages, but as insurance against food supply interruptions that could leave families dependent on raw grain reserves and hand processing. The mills that had seemed like luxury kitchen accessories in October had proven essential survival equipment by March, demonstrating how tools designed for convenience could become critical for basic sustenance when commercial food distribution systems collapsed. The regional weather data that became available after normal communication resumed confirmed what residents had experienced in their daily struggles with heating and food conservation. The winter had begun with the October 15th blizzard that first blocked railroad traffic, continued through January temperatures that swung between 36 degrees and 32 below zero, and persisted with February lows of 23 below that stressed even well-prepared heating systems. April had maintained nighttime temperatures around 3 below zero, proving that severe conditions had continued far beyond what most families had planned for during their autumn preparations. Railroad excavation reports documented the physical scale of the supply line failure that had forced Smet residents back onto local resource utilization and traditional survival methods. Snow cuts that required digging down 20 feet to reach the rails explained why train service had remained suspended for months rather than days, while descriptions of snow packed solid as concrete illustrated why conventional snow removal equipment had proven inadequate to restore normal transportation schedules. Pa's grass fuel method, initially mocked as the desperate improvisation of a family too poor to buy adequate coal supplies, gained recognition as a documented prairie survival technique with practical applications that extended beyond emergency situations. The twisted slough grass provided a renewable fuel source that required only labor to produce, making it valuable not just during supply crises, but as a regular supplement to purchased heating materials that could stretch expensive coal or wood through longer winters. The technique's origins in Russian Mennonite communities became part of the broader story about immigrant knowledge transfer that had adapted Old World survival methods to New World conditions. Families who dismissed grass fuel as primitive learned that the method represented accumulated expertise from settlers who'd already solved similar problems in different locations, knowledge that could be transferred and modified to work with local materials and climate conditions. Coffee mill flour production evolved from emergency food processing into a standard household skill that provided insurance against supply interruptions and gave families greater control over their basic nutrition. The ability to convert raw grain into bread flour meant that households could store wheat for longer periods than processed flour, while maintaining the option to plant the same grain if food security improved and agricultural needs took priority over immediate consumption. The social dynamics that had emerged during the crisis, lending mills, sharing fuel production knowledge, and coordinating resource conservation, established patterns of community cooperation that influenced how later supply disruptions were managed. Smet residents had learned that individual household preparation worked best when combined with neighborhood knowledge sharing and mutual assistance that allowed successful survival methods to spread quickly through the community when conventional planning failed. The broader lesson that emerged from the hard winter extended beyond specific techniques for grass fuel preparation and grain milling. The crisis had demonstrated that frontier communities dependent on single supply lines remained vulnerable to disruptions that could last months rather than days, making local resource utilization and traditional processing methods essential backup systems rather than obsolete practices that could be abandoned in favor of modern convenience. Paw's approach to winter preparation, trusting what grew locally and could be processed with available tools more than what had to be shipped in and purchased, became part of the accumulated wisdom that older residents passed to newcomers who arrived expecting that railroad reliability and commercial supply systems had eliminated the need for traditional survival knowledge. The hard winter proved that geography and weather could still overwhelm transportation systems, leaving communities dependent on whatever resources lay within walking distance and whatever processing knowledge residents possessed. The vindication was complete but understated. Families who'd laughed at twisted grass bundles in October quietly asked for instruction in the method by spring. Neighbors who'd considered hand-milled flour a sign of inadequate preparation began investing in coffee mills and grain storage systems that could provide food security during future supply interruptions. The methods that had looked like poverty and poor planning became recognized as practical wisdom that worked when modern systems failed, knowledge worth preserving and passing on to the next wave of settlers who would face similar tests of preparation and resourcefulness. When the experts had been wrong about railroad reliability and supply chain stability, the prairie had been right about the value of local resources and traditional processing, methods that could sustain life when convenience disappeared and survival required work.